So, how does the American approach to the whole situation in Israel and the Middle East work? Well, part of this comes down to our foreign policy establishment and how their view of things have kind of changed over time. But really, it's outside forces that are kind of affecting this. The neoliberal order is a worldview birthed by the American progressive establishment. The general idea is that the nations of the world allow their security to fall either directly or indirectly under that of American security apparatus. The United States will take the lead in foreign affairs. A rules based order is created through various international organizations, but with a general understanding that the United States is the lead element for those organizations. And ultimately, the United States will take the full lead in keeping the sea lanes open to facilitate worldwide trade. The neoliberal order is anti nationalist at its core. However, during the time of the Soviet bloc, the nationalism of minor states was tolerated in terms of if it was for the greater good of the neoliberal order. The creation of Israel in 1948 was not welcomed by the foreign policy establishment of the United States. On one hand, that establishment had been heavily filled by FDR appointees who believed European empires were the greatest threat to the world. Israel was seen as a project of the European empires. Secondly, the portion of the American foreign policy establishment that viewed the Soviet bloc as the greatest threat saw Israel as an impediment to them creating a NATO like bloc of nations across the Middle East. Truman's only purpose in recognizing Israel was a desperate last minute campaign stunt to swing Jewish voters over to him in order to win the election. He had no long term thoughts on how Israel worked in the greater view of things. When the Eisenhower administration rebuked Britain, France, and Israel when they attempted to seize the Suez Canal during the Suez Canal crisis, that actually showed a reversion to the actual policy of the American establishment. American foreign policy establishment has been woefully ignorant of the politics of the Middle East, and I would argue they still are to this day. At that time, Arab nationalists believed that the Americans were thwarting the attempts of British, France, and Italy, Israel when they attempt to seize the Suez Canal. Uh, they believed that the Americans were leaning to the Arab side. The Americans hoped to cobble together the Arabs into one large military bloc, and they hoped that they could just get everybody to ignore the issues between them and Israel. The Arabs demanded that the United States sell them arms. The United States opted not to. This caused the Arab states to turn to the Soviet Union for their arms instead. The Arab states would never consider the Soviet Union as a friend, but at the same time, uh, the Arab countries had no interest in Soviet politics. Due to the buffer of Turkey and Iran being between the Arab states and the Soviet Union, they saw the Soviet Union as no threat. However, since Israel was directly on their borders and clearly part of the Western security system, Israel was viewed as the Arabs' primary threat. The neoliberal order was forced to settle. As long as Iran and Turkey were in the sphere of the Western orbit, there was a means of blocking Soviet expansion into the Middle East. Israel therefore became the only Western outpost in a large sea of nationalist Arab states, and those states were hostile to the neoliberal order. Israel's ultra nationalist character was reluctantly accepted, making it kind of the red-headed stepchild of the neoliberal order. In early 1970s, the PLO was using Jordan as a base of operations attacking Israel. These attacks became so pronounced that it created a potential danger of drawing Jordan into a direct war with Israel, which it did not want. Jordan worked to scale back the intensity of the PLO operations against Israel. This resulted in the PLO attempting to overthrow the government of Jordan. Jordan retaliated by attacking the PLO and expelling it from Jordan. This would begin a slow process of Israel and Jordan cooperating via back channels on security measures. This would also undermine Jordan as a Palestinian supporter. That's known as Black September. The revolution in Iran in the late 70s would transform Iran from a pro-Western, pro-Israeli bulwark into a state completely opposed to the neoliberal order. In an attempt to rectify this, the Carter administration launched the secret Camp David Accords to try to create peace between Egypt and Israel. This agreement was mostly positive for the neoliberal order, although the Egyptians did not abandon the Palestinians on paper. In practice, they were accepting the existence of Israel and thus a much more limited version of Palestine. In the early 1980s, Israel would end up invading southern Lebanon in order to root out radical PLO elements. Many of the Lebanese Muslims are a mix of Sunni, Shiite, and Shiite adjacent religious sects. Due to the timing of this invasion and the Islamic Revolution that had completed in Iran, the Shiites in Lebanon looked to Iran for support. A group of followers from Lebanon explicitly supported Ayatollah Khomeini. Iran sent Revolutionary Guard Corps to Lebanon to train this new group. This group would end up becoming Hezbollah. Hezbollah embraces radical revolutionary Islam as stated in the Iranian Revolution. It is chartered as being against Israeli and American imperialism. Thus, it's against the neoliberal order. Hamas and Hezbollah have many ideological differences, being that the former is Sunni and the later is Shiite. Hamas is nationalistic and Hezbollah's a pan-Islamist belief system. They both agree that Israel as a Jewish homeland needs to be removed from the Middle East. During one of the Gaza uprising, Israel deported a little over 100 Hamas radicals to southern Lebanon. While in southern Lebanon, these militants created relationships with Hezbollah. They established communication lines and received training. Although they're not directly cooperative of each other, they do give each other support in terms of military material, intelligence, and safe havens. Iraq and the Soviet Union had been one of the biggest supporters of Hamas and the Palestinians, and both being overtly anti Israel. The first Gulf War severely degraded Iraq's influence in the Middle East, opening up the way for other Arab states to moderate their views on Israel. The collapse of the Soviet Union saw the end of a lot of direct material support to the Palestinian operations. This power vacuum brought the PLO to begin secret negotiations known as the Oslo Agreements. As part of the Oslo Agreements, the PLO recognized the existence of Israel. It also gained governmental autonomy for various regions occupied by the Palestinians. Some had more autonomy than others. The nature of this agreement is very complicated, and we will not go to get into detail on it here. The end of the Soviet Union and the defeat of Iraq also had major impacts on the foreign policy establishment of the United States. For a portion of this establishment, this meant that the neoliberal order believed it no longer had to tolerate the ultranationalism of Israel. There would be less sympathy for the clashes between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Palestinian militants. Paradoxically, this would also bring in the neocon wing of foreign policy establishment to prominence. Neocons are still very much in favor of the neoliberal order. However, neocons do not merely tolerate Israeli nationalism, they celebrate it as a way forward in the Middle East and use it to, or they sought to undermine and overthrow and occupy countries that were hostile to Israel. The Oslo Agreement would solidify the idea of a two-state solution. The land disputes were not completely worked out, but portions of them were. The PLO still existed, but now its primary function was to act as a representative organization for Palestinians in the refugee camps outside in Palestine and Israel. The new governing form the new governing form of the Palestinian territories would become the Palestinian Authority. Hamas rejected the outcome of the Oslo Accords and would continue militant action. Fatah was the majority stakeholder in both the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. Some of the more nationalistic elements of Israel's government was not fond of the Oslo agreements, but due to pressure from the United States and the rest of the world, they accepted them. Not to mention the fact that the agreements were mostly popular in Israel amongst the population. The agreements have never been fully in place due to the inability of the Palestinian Authority to fully control its militant elements, most notably Hamas. However, portions of the agreement giving the Palestinian Authority some control in the West Bank are still in place. So, what do you think in terms of, in a comment below, were you aware that Israel has more or less been agreeing to some form of two-party agreement pretty much from the get-go? Portions of the PLO, specifically Fatah, have been or have accepted the idea of a two-state agreement since about 1994, and Hamas has never accepted a two-state agreement. Tell me what you think on that. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not a regular viewer, check out my other titles. Surely you'll find things of interest. Subscribe. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.